If you had asked me what my life looked like a few years ago, I might have told you it was a roller coaster. But now that I think about it, that wouldn't be fair to roller coasters. At least they have ups. My story? It was more like a long, painful plunge into darkness with no warning and no breaks. It all began when I was just 11, a time when most kids were worried about homework and who to sit with at lunch. But for me, it was the beginning of something I wouldn't wish on anyone. My father had been sick for a while, the kind of sickness that steals laughter first, then strength, and finally, the man himself. When he passed, it felt like the world shifted beneath my feet. I remember the quiet in the house, not peaceful quiet, more like the suffocating kind that makes your ears ring. My mother, Rachel, was a school teacher. She tried. She really did. But grief didn't just weigh her down, it crushed her. I watched her go through the motions, but the light in her eyes dimmed day by day. Our small home in Austin, Texas, once warm and full of life, now felt cold and unfamiliar. Even the pictures on the wall seemed to mourn. For a while, it was just the two of us, limping through life the best we could. But not long after my father's funeral, a new figure appeared, Tom. He was a construction foreman, older than my mom by a few years, and brought with him a presence that immediately unsettled me. He had this way of looking through me, like I was background noise. Tom moved in quickly, too quickly. It didn't take long before his true nature surfaced. He wasn't cruel in an obvious way, but he was cold, unbending, and he didn't like me. That much was clear. Everything I did seemed to annoy him. My laugh was too loud. I didn't say please fast enough, and heaven help me if I spilled something at the dinner table. One night I knocked over a glass of orange juice. It wasn't a big deal, not to a normal person. But Tom exploded. I remember shrinking into my chair, cheeks burning, eyes darting toward my mother, silently begging her to say something, to defend me. But she didn't. She just stared at her plate. That silence? That hurt more than Tom's shouting ever could. Then came Sophie, my half-sister, Rachel's and Tom's baby girl. Her birth changed everything. The little attention I still received vanished overnight. Tom now had his real child, and I became nothing more than an expense and a nuisance. He made it clear, often and loudly, that supporting two children was a strain. And Rachel? She was lost in diapers and late-night feedings, barely aware I still existed. The day Tom suggested I move in with Aunt Martha, I felt my stomach drop. Aunt Martha, the woman I'd only heard of in harsh whispers. She was my mother's older sister, a retired school principal with a reputation for being cold, strict, and unyielding. I waited for Rachel to argue, to say no, to protect me. Instead, she nodded, softly, almost regretfully. "Catherine, it's for the best," she said, avoiding my eyes. "Aunt Martha will take good care of you." I didn't cry, not at first. I remember packing my little suitcase with shaking hands, trying not to show how scared I was. I stared around my room, taking in everything I was about to lose. My posters, my bed, the window with the little crack in the corner where the sunlight always snuck through. It wasn't much, but it had been mine. Martha's house was a fortress, large, old, and as warm as a hospital waiting room. It sat on the opposite side of Austin, surrounded by a tall fence that felt more like a barrier than protection. She greeted me with a stiff nod and a handshake, not a hug. Her rules were strict and endless. There was a right way to fold socks, a proper time for dinner, and even a specific volume I was allowed to speak at. I followed every rule, not because I wanted to, because I was afraid. Every mistake brought a disapproving glare or a sharp rebuke. There was no warmth, no laughter, no room for mistakes. I felt like an unpaid maid in someone else's life. Worse, she never let me forget that my mother had sent me there. She'd remind me casually and constantly how Rachel had washed her hands of me. One night I cracked. I used her phone to call Rachel. I just wanted to hear her voice, to ask her why she let me go so easily. But when she answered, her voice was distant, almost robotic. "You can't come back, Catherine," she said flatly. "It's better this way." That broke something in me. When Martha found out about the call, she punished me. More chores, earlier bedtime, no dessert. But the real punishment was emotional. The cold glares, the quiet judgment. I learned to hide every feeling, every flicker of anger or sadness. I became a ghost in her house, silent and obedient. A year later, her patience wore thin. One morning, she told me Rachel had stopped sending money and that I would have to leave. Just like that. As if I was a stray cat someone had stopped feeding. I had nowhere to go. That's when they sent me to Grandma Carol. I didn't know what to expect. I'd only met her a couple of times when I was younger. She lived on the edge of Austin in a small brick house with a garden that always smelled like lavender. The day I arrived, dragging my suitcase behind me, Carol opened the door with a warm smile and open arms. "Catherine," she said, pulling me into a hug, "you're home now." Just those 3 words, "You're home now," and for the first time in a long while, I believed them. Carol was in her 70s, a retired nurse with silver hair and twinkling eyes that made you feel seen. Really seen. Her house was tidy but not rigid. There were rules, sure, but they weren't about control. They were about kindness, respect, structure. "You'll have your own room," she told me as we walked down the hallway, "and your own space. But around here, we look out for each other." I felt something strange that night as I lay in my new bed, wrapped in a handmade quilt. I think it was hope. I hadn't felt it in years. Living with Carol felt like entering another world, one where I wasn't constantly afraid of messing up, one where someone actually asked how my day was and listened to the answer. Her home wasn't perfect, but it was peaceful, and after years of walking on eggshells, that peace felt like gold. She enrolled me in a new school a few days after I arrived. I was nervous, of course. I'd missed so much. I felt like an outsider with a tangled past I didn't want anyone to know. But Carol believed in me, and somehow, that belief gave me enough courage to walk through those school doors with my head held just a little higher. "Give it your best," she said, handing me a packed lunch and a gentle smile. "That's all I'll ever ask." Those words stayed with me, they still do. School turned out to be better than I expected. I wasn't the most popular, not by a long shot, but I started to find little pockets of joy, an encouraging teacher, a lab project that made my eyes light up, a quiet library corner where I could disappear for a while. I began to love learning. For the first time, I saw myself as someone who could be smart, capable, maybe even successful. Carol noticed, of course. She noticed everything. She always left the porch light on when I got home late from study group. She made sure I ate more than just cereal. She asked me about my classes, about the books I was reading, about my dreams. "You have a good mind, Catherine," she told me one evening over dinner. "You could be an engineer if you wanted to." That stuck with me. Engineering. It felt like such a big word, such a far-off dream. But the more I explored it, the more it felt right. I loved puzzles, logic, figuring out how things worked. I began reading books about women in science, staying after school for extra help in math and physics. Slowly, my confidence grew. I stopped thinking of myself as the girl who'd been thrown away and started thinking of myself as someone who could build her own future. But life wasn't without challenges. Carol was getting older, and though she never complained, I could see the fatigue in her eyes. Her steps were slower. Some mornings her hands shook just a bit too much. I stepped in where I could, helping with meals, keeping the house clean, reminding her to take her medication. It was a small price to pay for the safe haven she'd given me. "I've got it, Grandma," I'd tell her, waving off her offers to help carry groceries or fold laundry. "You took care of me, now it's my turn." We became a team, a quiet, steady team. And through it all, she never stopped encouraging me. When I brought home a report card full of A's, she celebrated with homemade chocolate cake. When I got my first part-time job at the library, she sewed a tiny good luck note into my bag. During high school, my world kept expanding. I applied for scholarships, entered science fairs, and devoured every article I could find about engineering. I also started to make real friends, people who didn't care about my past, who saw me for who I was becoming. And then came the day that changed everything. I was accepted into a well-known engineering program at a top university. I remember standing in the kitchen, letter trembling in my hands. "I got in," I whispered. Then louder, "Grandma, I got in!" Carol looked up from her tea, eyes wide, and then she burst into the biggest smile I'd ever seen. "Of course you did," she said, tears in her eyes. "You were always meant for great things." The first semester of college was intense. I moved into the dorms, juggled classes and a part-time tutoring job, and learned to live on way too much instant ramen. but I loved it. Every formula, every lab experiment, every sleepless night spent building a prototype, it made me feel alive. And through it all, Carol stayed close. She wrote letters, old-school style, on floral stationery. They were full of updates about her garden, reminders to eat real food, and proud little notes like, "You're doing amazing, sweet girl." I visited her every chance I got. We'd sit on the porch, sip sweet tea, and talk about everything and nothing. Those visits grounded me, reminded me why I was pushing so hard. Then came senior year. I was knee-deep in a capstone project and job interviews when Carol's health took a sudden turn. She ended up in the hospital after a fainting episode. I rushed home, skipping classes and canceling meetings. She smiled when she saw me. "Always so dramatic," she teased, patting my hand. But the truth was, things weren't good. The doctors didn't say much, but I could tell by the way they looked at me. Her heart was weak. Her lungs were struggling. I stayed by her side for days. She slept a lot. When she was awake, we talked about old times, about my future, about how proud she was. I held her hand and promised her I'd make her proud. She passed a week later, peacefully, with her favorite music playing softly in the background. Losing her gutted me. I had known it was coming, but it didn't make it any easier. It felt like losing my anchor, my protector, the one person who had truly loved me unconditionally. The funeral was small, but filled with warmth. People came from all over to pay respects to the woman who had once been their nurse, their neighbor, their friend. I stood there, holding a photo of her, heart heavy but full of gratitude. She had given me everything. But I wasn't prepared for what happened next. 2 days after the funeral, I opened her will. Carol had legally adopted me years before, and with no other close relatives, everything was left to me, including her modest savings, her house, and, to my utter shock, a trust fund with over $2 million she'd quietly built from smart investments over the years. I didn't cry when I read that part. I laughed, through tears, because of course she had planned for my future, right down to the last dollar. That was who she was. But before I could even take it all in, my past came crashing back in the most unexpected way. 2 mornings after the funeral, I woke up to the sound of voices in the driveway. At first I thought it was neighbors, or maybe someone delivering flowers, but then I heard her voice, sharp, familiar in the worst way. "Catherine, open the door, we need to talk." I froze. "Rachel." I hadn't seen my mother in years. Not since the day she told me I couldn't come home. Not since she gave me up without a fight. And now, out of nowhere, she was here, with Tom and Sophie. I opened the door slowly, pulse pounding. There they stood. Rachel looked older, but not softer. Tom looked exactly the same, though the bitterness on his face seemed deeper, like it had soaked into his bones. Sophie, she was grown now, around 22, standing behind them with an awkward half-smile. "Catherine," Rachel said, stepping forward like we were just picking up from a casual visit, "we heard about Carol. We're sorry, but we need to talk about the estate." I blinked. "The estate?" She nodded toward the house. "This place, the inheritance, the money. Of course that's why they were here. Carol left everything to me," I said flatly. "She adopted me years ago. It's all legal." Tom scoffed. "That doesn't mean it's fair. We're your family. We've fallen on hard times, and that house, that money, it could help all of us." I felt the heat rise in my chest. Family? These people threw me out like old furniture. They didn't write, didn't visit, didn't care. And now that there was something to gain, suddenly I mattered? "I'm not giving you anything," I said firmly. "Carol wanted me to have this. She made that choice because she knew what you all did to me." Rachel's face twisted into a scowl. "You're being selfish. We're struggling, Catherine. Do you even care?" I didn't answer. I couldn't. The words were too absurd. Sophie finally spoke up, voice quiet. "Maybe we could just stay for a little while, just until things settle down." I looked at her. The last time I'd seen her, she was a baby. She hadn't chosen any of this, but she hadn't exactly stood up for me either. Her silence in the background mirrored my own years ago. "No," I said, "you need to leave." They didn't. They unpacked their bags. Within an hour, they had started moving into the guest room, acting like this was their home. Rachel rearranged the kitchen drawers. Tom put his boots on the coffee table. Sophie scrolled on her phone, avoiding eye contact. It was surreal. I locked myself in my room and called Carol's lawyer. Explained everything. He was calm, professional, and, thankfully, on my side. "You have every right to ask them to leave," he said, "and if they refuse, you can file a police report." I exhaled for what felt like the first time all day. When I stepped back into the living room, Rachel was in Carol's armchair, flipping through mail. My mail. "I've spoken to a lawyer," I said. "You're trespassing. You have no legal claim to anything here." Rachel stood up fast. "You called a lawyer on your own family?" "You're not my family," I said, voice shaking but strong. "Carol was my family." Tom slammed his hand on the armrest. "You think you're better than us now, huh? Because you got lucky?" Lucky? I wanted to scream. Nothing about my life had been lucky. I had clawed my way up from rejection, abandonment, and loneliness. I had studied until my eyes blurred. I had worked jobs that made my hands blister. Carol didn't hand me a life. She gave me a chance. I did the rest. "You need to leave," I repeated, "now." But of course they didn't. They yelled. They threatened to go public, to smear my name, to call the press. They claimed Carol must have been manipulated. They said they'd sue. So I called the police. The officers who arrived were calm and respectful. I showed them the lawyer's letter, the adoption papers, the will. Rachel tried to argue. Tom ranted. Sophie sat on the stairs, staring at the floor. "Ma'am," one officer said to me, "you're within your rights. Do you want them removed?" "Yes," I said. My voice cracked a little, but I meant it. The officers gave them 10 minutes to pack. Rachel raged. Tom cursed. Sophie cried silently. As they left, Rachel turned and spat out, "This isn't over, Catherine. You'll regret this." I didn't answer. I just closed the door. Then I locked it and leaned against it until my knees gave out. The silence that followed was deafening. No yelling, no banging, no guilt trips, just the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the old wall clock Carol had loved. I was alone again, but not broken. Not this time. That night, I sat in Carol's old chair and let myself cry. For her, for everything. For the girl I used to be and the woman I was becoming. They had tried to come back for what wasn't theirs, but I hadn't let them. I stood my ground. And for the first time, I didn't feel like a scared kid trying to survive. I felt like a grown woman who had finally learned how to say no. After they left, the house felt different. Quieter, yes, but not empty. It was like the walls had exhaled with me, shedding the weight of confrontation. I moved through the room slowly, touching the things Carol once held dear. The ceramic mug with a chip in the rim, the blanket she crocheted during her night shifts, the photo of us at my high school graduation, framed in wood and love. I had lost her, but I hadn't lost everything. Grief is strange. It sneaks up on you in the calm moments, like when I made tea and reached for 2 mugs without thinking, or when I found a recipe in her handwriting tucked in the kitchen drawer. Some days I cried, others I laughed through the tears, but I gave myself space for all of it. That was something Carol taught me. Grief doesn't need to be tidy. I spent the next few weeks cleaning, sorting, and organizing paperwork. The lawyer helped tie up the estate, ensuring everything was protected. I made it official that Rachel and Tom had no legal standing, just in case they tried anything again. I changed the locks, I set boundaries, and I took time to simply breathe. But something inside of me wouldn't sit still. The inheritance wasn't just money to me, it was possibility. It was proof that Carol had believed in my future, even when I didn't yet believe in myself. So I made a decision. I used a portion of the $2 million to set up the Carol M. MacGregor Scholarship Fund. It was for students like me, those who had been forgotten, tossed aside, or told they weren't enough. It would help them chase degrees in engineering, science, or whatever set their hearts on fire. I remember the first day I launched the website. My hands shook on the keyboard. But when the first application came in, I cried. Not because it was perfect, but because I could already see the ripple effect. Carol's love, her patience, her sacrifice, they would live on. The fund gave me focus. It pulled me out of the fog and into purpose. I started meeting with local schools, partnering with community programs, even doing guest lectures about perseverance and engineering. I was never a fan of public speaking, but when I talked about Carol, about resilience, something in me lit up. Professionally, I kept climbing. I moved into a lead role at the engineering firm I'd worked so hard to reach. My team respected me, not just for my skills, but for the way I led, with clarity, heart, and a touch of sass. And personally, I began to open up again. I reconnected with old friends, went on long walks, learned how to make sourdough bread from scratch. I adopted a rescue cat named Olive, who liked to sleep on Carol's old chair like it was a throne. I even traveled. Paris, Kyoto, Banff. I saw places I'd only read about, and with every new destination, I felt another piece of myself return. The pain of what Rachel, Tom, and Sophie did, it faded. Not because I forgot, but because I refused to let it define me. I learned to forgive, not for them, but for me. Anger is heavy, and I was tired of carrying it. One afternoon, about a year later, I received a letter from Sophie. Handwritten, neat cursive. She apologized. She said she didn't understand back then, that she had followed her parents' lead because it felt easier than questioning them. She said she remembered me as kind, quiet, sad, and she asked if we could meet. No expectations, just coffee. I sat with that letter for hours. And then I wrote back. We met at a tiny bookstore cafe a week later. She looked nervous. I probably did too. But when I saw her eyes, uncertain but open, I knew I'd made the right choice. We talked for 2 hours. Not about the money, not about Rachel and Tom, just life. It was healing in a way I didn't expect. We're not best friends now, but we check in, and that's enough. Every now and then, someone asks me how I got through it. The childhood abandonment, the rejection, the drama after Carol died. They want a secret, a hack, a clean 5-step formula. But healing doesn't work like that. What I tell them is this. I survived because one person believed I mattered, because someone held the door open when the world slammed it in my face, and because eventually I learned how to keep that door open for myself. Carol didn't rescue me with money. She rescued me with consistency, with faith, with bedtime stories and warm meals and tough love. She didn't just give me a second chance. She gave me the tools to build one. And now I live my life as proof that the past doesn't have to dictate the future. I wake up each day in the house she left me, surrounded by light, memories, and a cat that snores. I drink tea from her chipped mug. I water her roses. I fund scholarships. I speak to students who feel invisible and remind them they're not. Sometimes I sit on the porch at sunset watching the sky turn gold. I talk to her out loud like she's still there. I hope you're proud of me, I whisper. And in the silence that follows, I swear I can feel her smile.